Time to take a look at Soviet tank losses in World War II. This video is mostly based on Dr. Jens Wehner video in German on this topic, who provided me with his script and data. I also added some additional information. A short look at some initial numbers. From 1941 to 1944, both sides lost 106,700 tanks, of which 23,800 were lost by the Germans and 82,900 by the Soviets. Note that these numbers include self-propelled guns. This is a staggering number and a good reminder that tanks were, like everything else in war, targets. A fact that those people that write the end of the tank articles seem to be rather oblivious to. Then again, they generally have very little understanding of tanks, combined arms and/or military history. These numbers also illustrate how characterized the war was by the massive employment of tanks. Note that the Soviet loss numbers are based on the official release by the Russian army from 1993, so shortly after the fall of the Soviet Union. Let's start with the basic numbers, namely the number of Soviet armored fighting vehicles delivered to the Red Army. From 1941 to 1945, the Soviets fielded 108,700 tanks and 23,100 self-propelled guns, like the Su-76M, which you can see here. As such, we have a total of 131,800 Soviet fighting vehicles. In terms of losses, we have 83,500 destroyed Soviet tanks and 13,000 self-propelled guns, so a total of 96,500. This means a loss ratio of 76.8% for the tanks and 56.3% for the self-propelled guns. The reasons for the lower self-propelled gun losses at first might suggest a different employment, for instance a more indirect fire role. This might be partially correct, but another reason is that in 1941 there were no mass-produced self-propelled guns fielded by the Red Army and the losses in 1941 were particularly high. Which brings us to the next point, the Soviet tank losses over the course of the war. In 1941 the Red Army entered the war with 22,600 tanks and another 5,600 were delivered by the industry. Until the end of 1941 it had lost a staggering number of 20,500, so 72.7%. Note that at this time of the war the Soviets had no mass-produced self-propelled guns, so the few dozen Su-5 don't count here. Particularly interesting here is that according to German numbers, the Germans were able to capture a large amount of these 20,500 tanks. The Germans reported the capture of 13,958 armored vehicles, but this number also includes armored cars like the BA-10 and other armored vehicles, not just tanks, according to the German source. Sadly, there is no distinction between the different types. Of course, the number might be inflated, but it only accounts for the captured vehicles the German troops reported, which was the official way. Yet we also know that units just took some vehicles for their own use and did not report them. So the number could actually be larger. The question of course arises how many of these were actually tanks. Considering the dire state of the Red Army's inventory, it is likely many of these vehicles were abandoned to the defects or even never brought into action. For the Battle of Dubno in summer 1941, Dr. Roman Töppel noted in his article for the Panzerkonferenz 2022, defective tanks were fundamentally a major problem for the Red Army, which lacked well-trained mechanics, spare parts and tractors for recovery. Even slight damage therefore often led to the total loss of the vehicles during retreats. To give you some data here, the Soviet 8th Mechanized Corps had 741 tanks at the outbreak of the war. Of those, 272 were lost in combat, that is 37%. Another 99 were missing in action, that is about 13%. So these could be lost in combat but also on the march or by other means. As such, 50% or more were lost outside of combat, since some of the missing vehicles likely were lost outside of combat as well, as you can see from the data. Of course, the ability of the Red Army to maintain and recover the tanks changed over the course of the war. So let us look at the loss numbers from 1941 to 1945. In 1941, 20,500 tanks were lost. In 1942, the losses of tanks sank to 15,100 self-propelled guns. Keep in mind here that in 1941 the war was way shorter since the German invasion started on the 22nd June 1941. Although in 1941 a lot of the Soviet tank losses were old models like the T-26 or BT tanks that were also quite light. So overall it is hard to determine how heavy the losses were compared between those 2 years. In 1943 the losses went up to 22,400 tanks and 1,000 self-propelled guns. For 1944 the tank losses sank again to 16,900 tanks, while the number of self-propelled guns rose by a wide margin to 6,800 self-propelled guns. This rate continued in 1945. In the last 4 months and a few days, the Red Army lost 5,000 self-propelled guns, but also 8,700 tanks, so the number of tank losses per month in 1945 was higher than in 1944. Of course, the question arises, if the Soviets lost so many tanks, were they able to replace their losses or not? As such, let us look at the inventory numbers over the course of the war. After the tremendous losses in 1941, the Soviet tank numbers in the beginning of 1942 were at 7,700 tanks compared to 22,600 tanks in June 1941. There are several reasons for this. First off, the Germans were able to capture a lot of factories that were used to produce tanks. Second, the Soviets were able to evacuate parts of these industries, but that also meant that the time was lost for getting new factories to produce in the more eastern regions. Third, the quality of tanks that were mainly produced now was quite different. The mainstay of the Soviet tank arm in World War II was the T-34, yet before it was the T-26. To put this in perspective, the T-26 has about 9.6 metric tons of weight. The T-34 with its 76mm gun has about 26.5 metric tons. So just in terms of weight, that is 2.76 times more per tank, and likely the T-34 was also more complex to produce, particularly in the early stages of mass production. Yet the Soviet industry over time was able to replace those losses. Additionally, due to Lend-Lease, American and British tanks were also added to the Red Army's pool of tanks. Some of them already arrived in late 1941. As such, in the beginning of 1943 the tank pool had increased significantly to 20,600 armored fighting vehicles. So close to the original number from 1941, but this time most of them were modern tanks. In 1944 this number rose to 24,400, and finally in the beginning of 1945 it was at 35,400 armored fighting vehicles. Of course, it is important to remember that the total number of available tanks does not equal the total number of tanks at the front line. This number was for various reasons far lower, for instance training, repairs, transit, etc. Here you can see how many tanks were at the front in January of the respective year. As you can see, for 1944 the total number of armored fighting vehicles was higher than in 1943, but fewer were at the front. As already previously mentioned, the quality of tanks also saw quite a change over the course of the war. Jens Wehner noted 2 trends. First, the tanks became heavier. At the beginning of the war, 94% of the 22,600 tanks, namely 21,200 tanks, were light tanks. A large number of them were T-26s. About 4% were medium tanks like the T-34 and T-28. Meanwhile, about 2% were heavy tanks like the KV-1. By 1945 the situation was quite different. Now only 35% were light tanks like the T-70, 44% were medium tanks like the T-34, and 21% were heavy tanks like the IS-2. As you can see, there was quite a dramatic change in the composition of the Soviet tank arm. Second, the number of non-tanks, namely self-propelled guns, grew dramatically. This is similar to Germany, by the way, since in the early war there were very few Sturmgeschütze or Panzerjäger, yet in late war the number had grown quite substantially. In 1941, as previously mentioned, the Red Army had basically no self-propelled guns, yet on the last day of the war this number had risen to 10,100 of a total of 34,500 armored fighting vehicles. So let us look at the losses by type. In total, the Soviet Union lost 33,400 light tanks like the T-26 or T-70, 44,900 medium tanks like the T-34-76 or later the T-34-85, 5,200 heavy tanks like the KV-1 or IS-2, 8,600 light self-propelled guns like the Su-76M, 2,100 medium self-propelled guns like the Su-85, and 2,300 heavy self-propelled guns like the Su-152. Unsurprisingly, the T-34 saw the highest amount of losses among the tanks. and the Su-76M had the highest losses among the self-propelled guns. One interesting question of the course is how many tanks were lost per day, and the result is really interesting. In 1941, the losses per day were 106 tanks per day. In 1942, this number was the lowest with only 41 tanks per day. In 1943 and 44, the number was almost the same with 64 and 65 respectively. In 1945, the number rose again to 106 tanks per day. Why the loss number in 1945 was so high? Well, I don't know. I suspect it was likely due to offensive operations to end the war and less pauses than in 1944, which also saw some major Soviet offensives. As previously mentioned, the losses in 1941 were quite different, since a lot of those were likely due to the high number of non-functional Soviet tanks. Yet there is far more to this. Of the 20,500 losses in 1941, more than half of them happened in the first few weeks of the war. According to Russian numbers, in 18 days, 11,703 Soviet tanks were lost. This means 650 tanks per day. To put this in perspective, a German tank division during Operation Barbarossa had on average a bit less than 200 tanks. So the Soviet in terms of tank losses lost basically more than 3 panzer divisions a day in that time frame. Keep also in mind that in June 1941 the Germans attacked with a total of just about 3,300 tanks, since the German tank production was rather low in the early years of the war, yet that is something for a different video. To summarize the Soviet losses. In 1941 the Red Army entered the war with 22,600 tanks. Over the course of the war the industry provided another 74,100 tanks. Additionally, the Western Allies delivered about 12,000 tanks as well. So we have a total of 108,700 tanks. When it comes to self-propelled guns, 23,100 were delivered during the war and the initial number was below 50. Now about the losses. A total of 83,500 tanks were lost and 13,000 self-propelled guns. That means 76.8% of all tanks were lost and 56.3% of the self-propelled guns. Together the loss ratio is about 73%. So at the end of the war the Red Army had 25,200 tanks and 10,100 self-propelled guns. So what can we derive from these numbers? First, tanks were basically consumables or cannon fodder. This becomes even more apparent if we look at the loss ratio of other weapon systems. For artillery the losses were about 51%, which is understandable since it's mostly an indirect fire weapon, yet the loss ratio for small arms was about 53%. Tanks were an important weapon system and had crucial impact on the battlefield, as such they were also lost in large numbers. A tank might be used as a hammer to crush the enemy, but unlike a hammer, it suffers more damage in doing so. Keep in mind, despite that the fact the tanks were lost in large numbers, this was not necessarily the case for their crews. Although many draw such conclusions, this is not supported by data. There were various occasions in World War II when tank divisions ran out of their infantry, yet not of the tanks or tank crews. Big thank you to Jens Wehner for providing the script. Special thanks to Peter from Tank Archives for helping me out with some additional information. Thank you for watching and see you next time.